Hello everybody, my name is Katalin Gennburg. I'm an elected member of the Berlin Parliament from the Left Party here in Germany, and I will speak today with you about urbanization, dynamics of capitalist urbanization in Berlin, but as well worldwide. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today about the working conditions of capitalist urbanization. I'm very much interested in your point of view, and so far I'm looking much forward to discuss with you later. Let me also add that I would love to be in Kiev today by that time and to talk with you directly, but as we all know, it's not possible that time, so hopefully I will come to Kiev and to visit you later. As I have around 45 minutes to speak about the capitalist city and left answers against gentrification, land grabbing and exploitation, and commercialization of all common goods today in nearly all metropolis worldwide, I would like to focus on 2 points. First of all, the Berlin case. The Berlin case as a divided city, a former divided city by the Berlin Wall, but as well today still a divided city as an eastern metropole with urban struggles resulting from the process of so-called unification after 1990. So we are here today, 30 years later, by that time, the right time to speak about the unification process and the results for urban planning and the questions of the city. The second point is the question of postmodern urban struggles in times of digitalization and platform capitalism and the so-called smart city. So let me start with the youngest history of urbanization in Berlin since 1990. The divided city is in Berlin seen in the space, the ideas and possibilities. We still have a divided city. Before the wall fall in Berlin, we had 2 parts of the city, and after the unification we got a long strip due to the city with a lot of space for ideas and possibilities that are now gone. And the question is, why is all this space just gone 30 years later? We now are really much struggling for needed space for social housing. We don't have enough space for building new schools. We are really in deep need for more public space and for parks and so on. So where does all the space gone that we had before in the 1990s? This is a question we can only answer by looking on the modus and the terms of capitalist urbanization. We have to focus on the modus of privatization, of expropriation of common goods, of financialization during the last 30 years, and a new political program of austerity. We have to understand the mode of financialization as the motor of the capitalist city. When we look now back, especially in the terms of housing politics, we see that a lot of common housing, public housing that were owned by the state were sold in the last 30 years. In Berlin, in Germany, but also worldwide. Now, we call this process financialization of the housing market. It's not only the selling of public houses, it's also a new mode of speculation with public goods, with housing, that came up before the financial crisis in Europe, but had a big new point within the financial crisis in the time of 2008 till 2009. Since that time, we have a new phenomenon in Berlin, but also in all metropolis worldwide, that we call the baton gold. It is since the finance markets are very unsafe for capital, people invest more and more in houses, in immobilities, and that makes the living conditions much more complicated. This is more or less a short story about Financialization. Now we have a lot of urban protests worldwide because the modus of Financialization is also very clearly seen in the living conditions and the exploding housing prices and renting prices in all cities worldwide. That's why we have a new urban question. In urban theories, we have since 15 years or 20 years the new spatial turn, so that we are discussing in science, in urban science, we discuss a lot about the spatial turn and the new question of space in our societies. And since more or less 10 years, this question of space really entered the sphere of politics, also in Berlin, but in other bigger cities as well. So let me now introduce the Berlin case. The Berlin case as well of Financialization as a special case, but as an example what happened due to the privatization process of within a city, and what came up of urban struggles against these processes of privatization. We had the unification process since 1990, plus we had big plans for the city of tomorrow. These big plans were made of capitalists. Let's say there was not a time to speak about common goods in a city of tomorrow. It was not the time after the unification to speak about the right to the city. It was a time of privatization of, now we see privatization of nearly 10% of the city, of the land of the city. So a huge privatization process were made since the last 30 years. And not only houses were privatized, also a big amount of floors and land were given away from the state. That has a lot to do with the bankruptcy, what we had in Berlin after big political fails after the year 2000. Now it is good to know that we are still bankrupt. We still have not enough money, but the questions of politics of finance and budgeting of the city we will not discuss today. Even it would be very necessary to discuss the budgeting politics from a left perspective as well. But let me stick into this bankruptcy situation after 2000. Berlin was bankrupt, and the federal state were told the Berlin government to sell public goods for getting back the money that the state was needed. That was a time when Berlin sold houses, electricity production, the water production, and so on. It was a time of big privatization that only 5 or 7 years later was really known as a big fail. Everybody was, was aware that this was a big fail to sell the water production, to sell the energy production, and to sell a lot of public houses, of course, because that made the city and the citizens very vulnerable against the private interests and for raising like daily costs. So that was a time when left activists in the city organized more and more on public questions, on questions of the city. It was a time that worldwide the questions of the right to the city became had a new time. We all know that the idea of the right to the city is made by the French philosopher Henri Lefebvre, that had the idea of discovering the city as a daily practice, a city as a social space where people live in and where people, by doing daily things, creating the city in daily things. It is not the city that we have on postcards. It's not the city that is being sold to invest. The city, by Henri Lefebvre and by the idea of the right to the city, is the city that we have in our daily lives. And the structures are made by the daily lives. So in that time, also in Berlin, left activists rised and were fighting against gentrification. It was a very early time of gentrification processes in Berlin, because in that time still Berlin had a lot of empty buildings and a lot of houses. It was a time I came to Berlin in 2004, and it was a time where you could look in the newspapers and found a lot of possibilities where to live. You could decide whether to live in Prenzlauer Berg or Friedrichshain, wherever you want. It was everywhere nearly the same prices, and it was very easy to get housing possibilities in Berlin. So, but still in that time, it was clearly to see that housing prices were rising, and so activists started like urban movements on the right to the city against gentrification processes. It is very important for me to tell the Berlin story as a story of the movements, as a story of the privatization, and as a story of the time and the history, the youngest history of the city after the unification in 1990. Because what we see now is the result of a shift in politics based on urban movements asking very crucial questions. The question of who owns the city, who has the right to be in the city, and who decides what the city should look like. These are questions that we see now also in Barcelona, in a lot of other cities worldwide. Lucky us that we can see this shift of politics worldwide. But in Berlin, this shift was made by urban movements. And since we had invented a new possibility of making public referendums. In 2011, I think, was the time that Berlin decided, the government decided, or the parliament decided to give the possibility of referendums. So since the last 10 years, we see loads of referendums concerning super different questions. The most popular referendum was definitely the referendum on the Tempelhofer Feld, which is a former airport in the middle of the city, in the heart of the city, that were closed, that had to close because Berlin had 3 airports. So the Tempelhofer airport had to close, and there was a group of people saying, okay, we had to save this space as a public space. We will not sell this space as it was made before with lots of spaces in Berlin, and to reclaim the city in this concrete case for the people. It had a lot to do that this referendum was successful, had a lot to do with the situation of the ongoing exploding rents in Berlin, and the knowledge, the more and more getting knowledge of the people, seeing it is not the new built houses that save our rents. It is not that houses that are building new can save us from losing our house. And this was a very important point of, I would say, no return of the so-called urban paradigm, to understand that the rent regulation is a different topic from the question of city development. We have to organize it in a totally new way to save people from selling the city, but it is it has to be made next to each other. So another referendum 2 years later was then a referendum on the exploding rents and for a new Berlin rent regulation made by the government concerning only the public housings. That referendum was successful, but the former Senate didn't let it pass. So when we were running for the election in 2016 as a left party, we're totally clear that we say, okay, we will bring this referendum to a law and we will make it happen. So that was my the long story in a short way, how the urban movements developed in Berlin. And it is necessary now to say, since I am a member of the parliament for the left party and I'm the speaker for urban planning, tourism and smart city, and as well I'm urban activist, it is really necessary for me to say that we as well invented 2 years ago now the Berlin rent cap that was founded due to a big network of civil society activists, like lawyers, like activists, like housing activists and politicians. And this is a really new way of founding politics as well, but as well the new rent regulation that in this way does not exist in Germany, and more or less not that often in Europe as well. The Berlin rent regulation is based on the right of Berlin, the right of the city to a price regulation by law. This is given us from the state that we have the law for price regulation. It is made for more or less 1.5 households in Berlin that live in houses and have to pay rents, which is a quite high number if you compare it to worldwide numbers, how many people own their houses or rent their houses. In Berlin, round about 85% of Berliners have to rent their houses and they are not owners of their houses. So 1.5 million households in Berlin will have lower rents, more or less, or the same stabilized rent. And we also have the possibility to lower down the rents from October 2020 from now on. The idea is not only, first of all, to save people. We had the situation that nearly 50% of Berliners were afraid to lose their houses. If like the half of the city population is afraid to lose their house, you really have a problem to solve. And if you're in charge, if you're in a government, you really have to find a solution for this problem. So that was like the frame that were given to us to say, okay, we definitely have to find a radical solution for the rent explosion in Berlin. So now we have the Berlin rent cap. At the same time, it is also economically very intelligent instrument, political instrument, because we expect round about 3 billion euros that are free for those people to buy other things, like having a coffee in a bar, having ice cream, or buying new shoes, whatever. But it is also necessary to reflect on this level of politics. We really have to be aware whom we make politics for and who is benefiting. So if 1.5 households in Berlin save money, then probably 3 billion euro are free for not paying your rent and not the house owners. So what we see in this case is very clearly a question of class struggle. You have on one side the owners of the houses, and on the other side people who have to pay their rent, who are working very hard in daily struggles, think about how to pay their rent, that are at the time before were exploding every year more and more. So it was a very clear question for us, a question as the left party, a question of class struggle, because we have to decide whether to organize that people spend all their money in paying their rents or not. So at the end of the day, we invented this new law here in Berlin, and it's very hard to say that, but it's not the end of the game. We don't manage now to stop capitalist urbanization. We still have loads of problems, and this is the reason because of the questions of financialization that I didn't talked about yet, but what I just want to add a few sentences on. You asked me before we talked about my speech today to also talk about questions of finance. I also made a few things about the financialization and the financial crisis and the politics of austerity before the financial crisis as well, but after financial crisis a huge more. And the question of how the financial market changed. And it is very necessary for us as left politicians but as well as activists, city activists, dealing with those questions of the right to the city, to understand the new mode of finance, of international capital, finance capital, of real estate capital, and how it works, and that it comes in masses to our city to be invested and to find new modes of speculation and get a new big money out of the city. This is really important to understand, because therefore we can understand why we see everywhere in the city real estate investments. We see that international well-known speculators are coming, investors coming to our cities, buying former industrial spaces and made them like whatever investments for other international financiers. So this term of speculation we have to first of all understand, but then we have to make a breakthrough. We have to discuss about building laws. We have to discuss about who owns the land, to say we don't sell land anymore, to reclaim the land from private owners by buying land, but also by expropriating land if they don't want to sell it to the city. It is a real big thing to talk about how to crash the system of privatization and of financialization. And therefore we need people who are really well known about these modes of international finance capital and how these investors are working, what they're looking for, and that they are probably not coming to our cities, be aware of what the city is in need for, but to manage their interests of capital. So this brings me directly to my last point, to the new mode of financialization in the times of digitalization and the so-called smart city. It is actually a big issue I would love to talk about much longer. Will try to keep it short because it touches a lot of things, a lot of spheres we are dealing with. It touches the new modes of working, the new mode of like home working, and a new mode of having startups everywhere. We see big industries want to transform themselves to be aware of getting taken away from like big companies like Amazon and so on. We see new big tech capital coming to our cities. We see big tech companies investing in our cities. We have to be aware of new big platforms having their base, their economic base in our cities, like Amazon, Zalando, Lieferando, all those new platforms that can only make money out of the city because the city is such a dense network of people living together, having daily needs and practices. So these we could talk about very long. I would like to focus on the idea of the tech-driven city development that were brought up in the last 10 years. The smart city is a so-called smart city, not a stupid city. That is the first big thing I really don't like in this term, because the cities were always clever. Why should they not have been clever? So the smart city is a new thing invented by more or less tech companies, because since we discuss how the digitalization is changing our daily lives, tech companies thought, okay, what can we sell to people in their daily lives? Which products can we sell? At the same time, since we look at the climate crisis and huge refugee movement coming up from the climate crisis, climate refugees have to leave their countries because it's flooded or burned. Since that time, we see the metropolis worldwide getting bigger and bigger. It is said that more or less 70% of the worldwide inhabitants are living in the city. So it is called the century of the urbanization. Since that time, it is also the question, how can we make cities resilient from the results of the climate crisis? Cities are very vulnerable, because if climate changes, of course, bigger cities as like the places of international capital are very vulnerable on climate changes and big catastrophes. So that was a time, and 10 years ago, that a big technology company people said, okay, let's invent the idea of a technological driven new city that can make cities aware on climate crisis, as well as protect from the results of the climate crisis. I would say, as a left politician, it is not possible to build technological things to save people from the result of this capitalist climate crisis. We really have to all together change the system to solve the climate crisis. So this is a general criticism. But on a very concrete level, we can see that the technological driven city development ideas are made for rich people. We can see that the idea of smart homes with intelligent freezers and intelligent windows, a home that works in itself and thinks in itself, it needs a lot of resources. This, first of all, of course, not very ecological. It is also a question of the so-called first world and the second world, the global south and the global north, and who gives the resources to whom to protect itself because of the results of the climate crisis. And at the same time, we see that this technological-driven city development is not based on humans. It is not based on human needs. It is not based on what we see as a city, the daily structures made by the people to just have their daily lives. So if we talk about the smart city, we have to talk about technological politics. We have to talk about tech companies and their interests to invest, to sell their products in the city. The city as a big market to sell products. We as a left definitely have to talk about the class questions in this. We have to talk about the the results for the global south, what comes out of this big hunger of technological products and resources. But at the end of the day, we also have to talk about what digitalization for what? Who needs digitalization for what? What is needed in a city structure, and what can digitalization do for us? So then we talk about data politics, we talk about the access to technology, and therefore we can really invent a new left idea of a smart city, of new left ideas of technology politics. Definitely, we should do that. But at the same time, we really have to talk about big platforms that see our cities just as a consuming market. We talk about Uber, we talk about Airbnb. We definitely have to smash this system of consuming, of privatization of the public space, just for those platforms to get their money out of the city. So this is more or less the big thing on the question of the smart city. I think we really have to combine the, let's say, more or less old-fashioned questions of housing, like rent control and keeping safe houses for everybody, with the really new things of terms of capitalization of the urban space in the time of digitalization, because we cannot decide whether to discuss one thing or the other. We have to discuss it together. We can definitely find alternatives of regulation of the city. We have to find big alliances to really strengthen our struggles together, and as well we have to find international corporations. And therefore I'm really interested in your questions, statements and whatever, and I'd like to thank you.